The man didn't knock. That was the first thing Eliza Whitmore noticed, the way Silas Crow pushed open the door of the Clearwater Employment Office like he owned the building, which he probably did. He walked straight past the line of waiting women without a glance, dropped a folded paper on the clerk's desk, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Tell Hawthorne I'm sending him someone decent this time, not another one of these." He waved his hand at the room the way you'd wave at flies. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Eliza was third in line. She had been standing for 40 minutes in the August heat, her worn leather suitcase sitting on the floor beside her feet, her last dollar folded inside her shoe because she didn't trust the lining of her coat pocket anymore. She watched Silas Crow button his jacket, turn, and walk back out through the door. She looked at the clerk. The clerk looked at the paper. Then he looked at Eliza, really looked at her, and something shifted in his face. Not cruelty exactly, worse than that. Recognition. Like he already knew how this was going to go, and he was sorry about it, but not sorry enough to change anything. If you've ever stood in a room where someone decided your worth before you opened your mouth, then you already know what happened next. And if you haven't, watch closely. Because this is where Eliza Whitmore's story actually begins. Before we go further, if stories like this one speak to you, if you believe that the people who get overlooked are sometimes the ones carrying the most, subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Clearwater, Montana, 1886, and a woman who walked into the wrong room at exactly the right moment. The employment office in Clearwater was a narrow building wedged between a grain supplier and a barber shop, and it smelled like sawdust and old paper, and the particular kind of anxiety that collects in rooms where people wait to be chosen. There were 6 women ahead of Eliza when she arrived that morning. By the time the clerk worked through the first 2, 3 more had come and gone, turned away for reasons that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with the particular calculation men made in 1886 when they looked at a woman and decided in under 10 seconds whether she was worth the trouble. Eliza had been through this calculation many times. She knew how it worked. She was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, built in a way that the world had always described with words she'd long since stopped flinching at. Large, heavy, sturdy, stout. She wore a dark blue dress that had been washed so many times the color had softened to something approaching gray, and her brown hair was pinned back with a practicality that left no room for vanity. She was not what any frontier household in the summer of 1886 would have called a desirable hire. She was also the only woman in that room who had actually run a kitchen. Not assisted, not helped, run. 6 years at the Brennan House in Billings, where she'd managed a crew of 4 and fed upward of 30 ranch hands, 2 shift workers, a revolving door of traveling merchants, and one particularly difficult widow named Mrs. Clarence, who had opinions about salt that bordered on the theological. Before that, 3 years cooking for a logging camp outside of Missoula, where the men worked 14-hour days and ate like they were storing food for winter, which some of them literally were. She could plan a week of meals from half a pantry. She could stretch a 20-pound sack of flour into a miracle. She had once kept a kitchen operational for 11 days during a supply blockade that had the logging camp's manager openly weeping by day 4. None of this was written on her face. None of this was visible to the clerk. What was visible was the rest of it. The clerk's name was Mr. Aldous Finch, and he had the unfortunate habit of pressing his lips together when he was uncomfortable, which meant his mouth had been basically a straight line since Eliza stepped through the door. He was not a bad man. That was almost the harder thing. He was simply a man who had never been asked to look past the surface of anything, and so he never had. "Name," he said, without looking up from the ledger. "Eliza Whitmore." "Position applying for?" "Cook. I saw the posting for Ravenwood Ranch." He wrote something down. "Experience?" she told him. All of it. The Brennan House, the logging camp, the supply management, the crew she'd supervised. She kept her voice steady because she'd learned a long time ago that emotion in a room like this was a weapon that only cut one direction, and it wasn't toward the person behind the desk. Finch listened, or appeared to listen. He kept writing, which was either a good sign or the performance of one. When she finished, he looked up, and there it was. That look. The quick practice survey that started at her face and moved downward and came back up, and in the space of 2 seconds assembled an entire verdict. "The position at Ravenwood is for a household cook," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne is particular about—" He stopped, rephrased. "The household has certain expectations." "About cooking," Eliza said. "About the overall situation." "I'm applying to cook," she said, "not to be a painting on the wall." Someone behind her made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Something caught between one. Finch's mouth pressed tighter. "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Whitmore, I don't make the decisions at Ravenwood. I only facilitate, then facilitate," she said. "Write my name in whatever column it needs to be in and send it to Mr. Hawthorne. Let him decide." There was a pause that felt about 10 years long. "You understand," Finch said carefully, "that there are other candidates." "I'm sure there are," Eliza said. "And when Mr. Hawthorne has seen all of them and found that none of them can do what I can do, my name should be easy to find." She reached into the small leather fold she carried inside her coat and placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. References. 3 of them. She'd written them out herself the night before, in the boarding house room she'd paid for with the second to last of her money. The handwriting was neat and factual. No decoration. Finch picked it up. Read it. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it recalibrated slightly. "I'll pass this along," he said. "Thank you," said Eliza, and she picked up her suitcase and went to wait on the wooden bench against the wall. She sat there for 2 hours. She watched 4 other women go through the process, watched 2 of them leave with addresses in their hands, both of them younger, both of them smaller, both of them hired for positions that she could have done blindfolded. She didn't say anything. She looked out the window at Clearwater's Main Street, at the horses tied to posts and the dust that never really settled, and the way the summer light sat heavy on everything, pressing down. She was hungry. She'd had half a biscuit that morning, which she'd eaten slowly to make it count. She was tired in the kind of way that lives in your bones rather than your muscles. The tiredness of someone who has been fighting the same battle for so many years that the fight has become its own kind of normal. She did not feel sorry for herself. She had tried that once, in the winter of 1881, after the logging camp closed, and she'd spent 6 weeks unable to find work in any kitchen in Missoula, despite applying to everyone she could walk to. She'd spent those weeks in a room above a laundry, eating crackers and tea, writing letters to establishments that didn't write back. At the end of 6 weeks, she'd looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the wash basin and had a very clear, very quiet thought. This is either going to break you or it isn't. And she'd decided, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has no one to fall back on, that it wasn't. She hadn't felt sorry for herself since. Around noon, the door to the back office opened and Finch came out, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet, something that might have been reluctant respect or might have been simple surprise that she was still there. "Mr. Hawthorne will see you," he said. Eliza stood up, picked up her suitcase, and walked through the door before he could change his mind. Nathaniel Hawthorne was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected, some rigid cattleman with a jaw like a fence post and eyes that had never questioned themselves. What she got was a man who looked like he hadn't slept reliably in months. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean in the way that people go lean when they've been carrying too much for too long, with deep lines around his eyes, and the kind of weathered skin that spoke less of vanity and more of a life spent outside without ever thinking much about it. He sat behind a plain wooden desk in the small office Finch had loaned him for the afternoon, and he had her reference sheet in his hand, and he was reading it when she came in. He looked up. He did not do the survey. That was the first thing she noticed. He looked at her face, and then he looked back down at the paper. "You ran the kitchen at the Brennan house," he said. 6 years. Brennan's had, 30 hands at peak season? 32 the last 2 years, plus house staff and occasional guests. "You managed supplies yourself?" "I did, including tracking against delivery records, which, based on what I understand about Ravenwood's situation, may be relevant." He looked up again. This time he held it. "What do you understand about Ravenwood's situation?" "That it's struggling," she said. "Enough that you're in Clearwater yourself rather than sending your foreman. Men who are comfortable don't come to employment offices in person." Something moved in his face. It wasn't quite amusement, more like the expression of someone who's been surprised and isn't sure how to categorize it. "You're direct," he said. "I found that indirect takes longer and usually arrives at the same place." He set the paper down and looked at her again. But it was a different kind of looking, not an assessment, something closer to actually seeing. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 9. She's been quiet since her mother passed. 18 months ago. The last 2 cooks I hired left within 3 weeks. One said the ranch was too isolated. The other didn't give a reason, which is usually worse." "What was wrong with the kitchen?" He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The kitchen. If 2 cooks left without settling in, either the house was inhospitable in ways beyond isolation, or the kitchen wasn't functional. Which was it?" A pause. "Both, probably. I'd need to see it before I could tell you what it needs. You haven't agreed to take the position. Neither have you agreed to offer it." He was quiet for a moment. Out the window, the sounds of Clearwater's main street filtered through. A horse, someone's raised voice, the clank of something metal, mundane frontier noise, the stuff of every ordinary afternoon. "The other candidates," Nathaniel said, "were more—" He stopped. "Suitable," Eliza finished. "They were more suitable." He didn't deny it. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "I'm not asking you to take a chance on me because I deserve sympathy. I'm asking you to make a business decision. You have a ranch that's struggling. You have a household that needs managing. You have a daughter who's grieving and workers who need feeding well enough that they can do their jobs. I can do all of that. Not because I'm willing to try, because I've done it." She gestured at the paper on his desk. "Those names are real. Write to them." "I already did," he said quietly. "This morning, before I left the ranch. Sent a writer." She hadn't expected that. "I like to know before I sit down with someone," he said. "Saves time." "And?" "I only got one reply back before I left. Elias Brennan himself. He said—" Nathaniel paused, seemed to be remembering. "He said you were the best cook he'd ever employed. He also said you were the most stubborn woman he'd ever met, and that if I was smart, I'd hire you immediately, and if I was stupid, I'd let someone else get to you first." Eliza said nothing for a moment. "He always did like to editorialize," she said. That was when Nathaniel Hawthorne almost smiled. It didn't fully form. It was more the ghost of one, appearing at the corner of his mouth for a second and then going back wherever smiles went in that face. But it was there. "When can you start?" he said. "I'm here now," said Eliza. "My suitcase is outside." The wagon ride to Ravenwood Ranch took the better part of 3 hours, and Nathaniel Hawthorne said almost nothing for most of it. This did not bother Eliza. She had worked with enough taciturn men to know that silence wasn't always hostility. Sometimes it was just the natural state of a person who'd spent too many years with no one to talk to. She watched the landscape instead. Montana in August was a particular kind of beautiful that she'd never quite been able to explain to people who hadn't seen it. The light sitting golden and thick over everything, the grass gone dry and pale, the mountains in the distance like something the sky was leaning on. She had lived most of her adult life in this territory, and she still found herself surprised by it sometimes. The scale of it. The way it made problems feel simultaneously very large and very small, depending on the angle. Partway through the ride, Nathaniel said, without preamble, "The last cook, the one who left without a reason. Her name was Mrs. Aldridge. She lasted 19 days. Eliza waited. "She complained about the water quality," he said. "She complained about the stove. She complained that Lydia—" He stopped. "My daughter. She said Lydia was unsettling." "In what way?" "She didn't talk. Still doesn't much. After her mother, she just went quiet." He was looking straight ahead at the road, his hands on the reins. "Mrs. Aldridge said she made the kitchen feel haunted." Eliza thought about a 9-year-old who had stopped talking after losing her mother. She thought about what that must look like from the outside. A small, silent child appearing in doorways, watching. She thought about what it actually was, which had nothing to do with being haunted. "The child isn't unsettling," Eliza said. "She's grieving." Nathaniel said nothing. "They don't look the same," Eliza added, "but from a distance they can seem like it." Another long silence. Then, "Do you have children?" "No." Have you ever been? "No," she said again. Simple fact. No wound in it, though there had been once. She'd sealed that room years ago, and she didn't have any cause to open it now, certainly not on a wagon to a stranger's ranch in the August heat. He didn't ask anything else. She was glad of that. When Ravenwood finally appeared, cresting a low hill and spreading out below them, the main house and outbuildings and the fences stretching toward the mountains, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement exactly. Something more careful than that. Something that said, "Pay attention. This matters." The ranch was beautiful, and it was in trouble. Both of those things were visible from the same distance. The main house was large and well built. Someone had put real care into it at some point. But there were small failures everywhere if you knew how to look. A fence needing mending, a barn door hanging slightly wrong, the garden on the east side of the house gone to dry weeds and neglect. The kind of incremental deterioration that happens when a place has lost its center of gravity. She filed it all away without saying anything. They pulled into the yard and 2 ranch hands came to take the horses. They were polite, efficient, and visibly curious about her, though none of them said anything out of line. She caught a few sideways glances, the particular recalibration of men who are trying to figure out what category to put you in. Let them figure, she thought. She had work to do. Nathaniel showed her through the front of the house, which was large and dusty in ways that went past ordinary neglect. The kind of dust that settles when people stop caring whether it's there. The main hallway, the sitting room, the dining room with its long table that looked like it hadn't been used for its original purpose in months. She noticed the family portraits on the wall, and in one, a woman she didn't need to be told about, dark-haired, with Nathaniel's daughter's eyes looking back at her from a time before. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and when Nathaniel pushed open the door and stepped aside to let her in, Eliza walked in slowly and just stood there for a moment. It was bad. Not unfixable. Nothing was unfixable, but bad. The stove was an older model, but it was solid enough if cleaned properly. It just hadn't been. The preparation surfaces were poorly organized, arranged by someone who'd never actually had to move fast while cooking. The storage was chaotic, preserves mixed with dry goods, mixed with items that had no business being in a kitchen at all. The pantry door stuck on a warped hinge. The window over the basin let in good light, but also let in flies because the screen had a tear in it. She stood in the middle of it and turned slowly, the way a person turns when they're taking inventory. "It needs work," Nathaniel said from the doorway. Something in his voice was braced for judgment. "It needs organization," Eliza said. "There's a difference. The bones are fine." He exhaled. A small thing, but she heard it. "When do the hands eat?" "Breakfast at 5:30, midday at noon, supper at 6. "How many?" 12 on the payroll, 8 here most days, some rotate. "And the house?" "Myself, my daughter, my father, when he comes down." A pause. "He mostly doesn't." She turned that over for a moment. A father who mostly didn't come down. 18 months of grief lived in the geography of a house where everyone had retreated to a different room and stopped meeting in the middle. "I'll need a full inventory of the pantry," she said, "and I want to see the supply records, the delivery logs, the expense ledgers, whatever you have." Nathaniel's brow shifted slightly. "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because the kitchen doesn't fail in isolation. If something's wrong in here, it usually reflects something that's wrong further back. I like to understand the whole system." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll have Victor pull the records for you." "Victor?" "My accountant. He handles all the supply contracts." She nodded like this meant nothing to her. In her experience, the things that were supposed to mean nothing were usually the things worth remembering. She met Lydia Hawthorne that evening. She had been in the kitchen for 4 hours, taking inventory, making a list, throwing out 3 things that should have been thrown out weeks ago, and producing a supper for 8 ranch hands and 1 rancher from whatever she could assemble quickly enough to be serviceable. It was not her finest work. It was the best she could do with what she had, which was not the same thing, but she'd long ago made peace with the fact that good cooking required time and resources, and that showing up was better than not showing up. The hands ate without complaint, which was neither high praise nor low. Nathaniel ate at the main table alone, which she understood without asking. She ate standing at the kitchen counter, which was her habit. She was washing up when she felt it, that specific sensation of being watched. She turned. The child was standing in the kitchen doorway, half in shadow, half in the light from the window. She was small for 9, or maybe she just seemed small. There was something about her posture, the careful stillness of her, that made her appear younger than she was. She had her father's dark hair and the eyes Eliza had seen in the portrait. She was wearing a nightgown, and her feet were bare, and she was looking at Eliza with the particular intensity of a child who has learned to observe because talking has stopped feeling safe. "Hello?" Eliza said, plainly, not with the high, careful brightness that adults often use with grieving children, the voice that tries too hard and ends up saying nothing. Lydia said nothing. "I'm Eliza," she said. I'm going to be the cook. You probably already knew that." Lydia looked at the stove, then at the counter, then at Eliza. "The kitchen's a mess," Eliza said conversationally. "I know, I'm fixing it. It'll take a few days, but it'll be better." She turned back to the dishes. "You can come in if you want. You can also not come in. Either one is fine." She heard nothing, assumed the child had gone. Then she heard the soft sound of bare feet on the kitchen floor, and she didn't turn around because she had the feeling that being looked at directly would end this, whatever this was. She kept washing, kept her movement steady. The child stood somewhere behind her for a long moment. Then she left, as quietly as she'd come. Eliza kept washing. She thought, that child is not haunted. She is waiting. Waiting to see whether this person was going to stay. Waiting to see whether this person was going to be someone she could afford to know. It was, when you thought about it, a reasonable question. For a 9-year-old who had already watched one important person leave and not come back, it was the only rational question. Eliza didn't know yet whether she was going to stay. She didn't know if this ranch was going to be worth staying for. She didn't know what was wrong with the supply records, or why the kitchen had felt abandoned before she got here, or what exactly was happening in the ledgers that Nathaniel's accountant managed. She had suspicions, but suspicions weren't facts, and she had made it a rule to distinguish between the two. She finished the dishes, dried her hands, and looked around the kitchen, her kitchen now, at least for tonight, and thought about what needed to happen tomorrow. There was a lot that needed to happen. She was not afraid of it. That was something she'd figured out about herself a long time ago. She didn't fear the size of a problem. She feared not starting. Once she started, the fear usually went somewhere else and left her to work. She pulled her notebook from her coat pocket. She always had a notebook. She'd had one since her 3rd month at the logging camp when she'd realized she was carrying too many numbers in her head, and sat down at the kitchen table and began to write. Supply inventory, incomplete, cross-reference against delivery records. Pantry reorganization, 3 to 4 hours. Stove cleaning and calibration, 2 hours minimum. Window screen, repair or replace. Hinge on pantry door, find someone to fix or fix it herself. Ranch hands. Names, dietary considerations, any complaints about previous meals. Lydia. She stopped at Lydia's name, looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote, very simply, patience. Outside, the Montana night was settling in. That particular darkness that has no ceiling, that goes all the way up and keeps going. The ranch was quiet, the way ranches go quiet. After the work stops, the distant sound of animals, the creak of the house cooling down, wind across the grass. Eliza sat in the kitchen of a struggling ranch in the summer of 1886 and made her lists and felt, beneath the tiredness and the uncertainty and the 1,000 things she didn't know yet about this place, something small and stubborn she recognized. It felt like the beginning of something. She didn't know what yet. That was fine. Beginnings rarely told you their endings. You just had to show up and keep looking, keep counting, keep writing everything down in a notebook until the shape of things started to come clear. She turned the page and kept writing. The next morning, she was in the kitchen before 4. Not because she had to be, breakfast wasn't until 5:30, but because she'd learned over the years that the hour before the house woke up was the best hour, the one that belonged entirely to her. She lit the stove, got the coffee going, and started on the biscuits while it was still dark outside, the kitchen lit by the oil lamp on the counter. By the time the first ranch hand came in, stamping dust off his boots at the back door, the biscuits were out, the eggs were on, and the coffee was strong enough to be useful. The hand stopped in the doorway. He was mid-30s, wiry, with a look of someone who'd been getting bad breakfasts for long enough to be suspicious of a good one. "Miss Whitmore?" he said, reading her name off some internal list, apparently. "That's right," she said. "Sit down." He sat, 2 more came behind him, then 3, then the rest of them in a loose, shuffling procession that had the quality of people who haven't quite figured out the new order of things yet. She fed them without ceremony, kept track of who ate what, noticed the one who didn't touch the eggs, and the 2 who drank 3 cups of coffee each, and the foreman, a quiet man named Gerald, who thanked her twice and meant it both times. Nathaniel came in at 6, after the hands had gone. He poured his own coffee and stood at the counter and drank it. "Better?" he said. She didn't preen. "It'll keep getting better." He set the cup down. "Mate, Victor will have those supply records for you this afternoon. He wants to go over them with you himself." "That's fine," she said. She had already decided in the quiet hour before dawn that she was going to be very careful around the supply records, very methodical. She was going to look at everything twice and assume nothing, because in her experience, the things that were wrong had a way of hiding behind the things that were almost right. She was going to start counting, and she had the feeling, the specific, particular feeling she'd learned to trust over many years of running kitchens, that whatever she found in those numbers was going to be important. She just didn't know yet how important. She turned back to the stove and let that thought sit where thoughts sit when you're not ready to look at them directly, and she started on the bread for the midday meal, and the morning light came through the cleaned window. She'd fixed the screen after supper the night before, with a piece of new mesh she'd found in the storeroom, and fell across the kitchen floor in a way that made the room look, for just that moment, like something that was beginning to remember what it was supposed to be. The supply records arrived that afternoon in a wooden box. Not a folder, not a ledger tucked under someone's arm. A box, the kind used to store documents that had accumulated over time without anyone deciding what to do with them. Victor Hale carried it into the kitchen himself, set it on the table with a thud that sent a small cloud of dust into the air, and stood back with his hands clasped in front of him like he was waiting to be thanked. Eliza looked at the box, then at Victor. He was a man of perhaps 50, slope-shouldered, with a neatness about his dress that felt deliberate in the way that neatness sometimes does, like it was compensating for something. His suit was clean, his hair combed, his boots polished to a degree that didn't quite make sense for a ranch. He had small eyes that moved a little faster than his face did, which was the kind of thing you noticed, and then forgot about, and then noticed again. "Everything's in there," he said. "Delivery receipts, monthly tallies, the contract summaries. I've organized it by quarter." "I appreciate that," Eliza said. "If you have questions, I'm happy to walk you through it. The system's it's developed over time, takes some familiarity." "I'll start on my own," she said, "and come to you if something isn't clear." Something passed across his face. Too fast to name. "Of course," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne mentioned you had a background in supply management." "I did." "At a boarding house, I believe." "A ranch boarding house," she said, "and a logging camp before that. Different scales, same principles." He smiled. It was the right shape for a smile. "Well, if you need anything clarified." He patted the side of the box with one hand. A proprietary gesture, she noted, the way you touch something you think of as yours, and left the kitchen. Eliza waited until she heard his footsteps go down the hall. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and opened the box. It took her the rest of the afternoon. She wasn't looking for anything specific. Not yet. She was doing what she always did when she came to a new place, reading the numbers the way you'd read a person's face, looking for the expressions that didn't match what was being said. She'd learned this at the Brennan house, where the previous cook had been quietly helping himself to the premium cuts for 3 years before anyone noticed. The numbers had been telling that story the whole time. They just needed someone to sit down with them long enough to hear it. The Ravenwood records weren't dramatic. That was the first thing she noticed. There were no obvious gaps, no entries that jumped out as wrong. Everything was dated, categorized, cross-referenced in Victor's precise, small handwriting. It looked correct the way a well-rehearsed story looks correct. Smooth at the surface in a way that real things rarely are. She started with the flour. Flour was the easiest because it was consistent. The same grade, ordered in the same amounts, from the same supplier in Clearwater. She went back 6 months and wrote out the delivery amounts against the usage estimates she'd worked out that morning, based on the number of hands eating 3 meals a day. Then she looked at the reorder frequency. The numbers didn't match. Not by much. That was the thing. Not by an amount that would make you put down your coffee and say something was wrong, but by a small, consistent margin, a 10-pound discrepancy here, 12 pounds there, that accumulated over 6 months into a number that wasn't small at all. She turned to the salted beef, then the dry goods, then the lamp oil, which had nothing to do with the kitchen but whose records were in the box, so she read them anyway. Same pattern. Small shortfalls, consistent timing, always just below the threshold where you'd look twice. She sat with that for a while. Then she closed the box, rinsed her coffee cup, and started on supper. She needed to think, and she did her best thinking while her hands were busy. By the time she had the stew going, she had decided 3 things. First, she wasn't going to say anything yet, because she didn't have enough. Second, she was going to keep her own records going forward, independent of whatever was in that box. Third, she was not going to let Victor Hale see her notebook. It was Gerald who told her about the garden. Gerald Marsh was the foreman, the quiet man who'd thanked her for breakfast on her first day. He was in his late 40s, sun-darkened, the kind of man who measured words the way some people measured gold, spending them only when necessary. He came to the kitchen one morning on the 4th day, when Eliza was reorganizing the pantry shelf by shelf, and he stood in the doorway until she acknowledged him because he was clearly the sort of person who waited to be acknowledged. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Marsh, coffee's on the counter." He poured himself a cup and stood there for a moment. She waited. "The East Garden," he said. "It went to weed when Mrs. Hawthorne passed. The ranch had a kitchen garden there. Herbs, some vegetables, kept the supply costs down in summer. Nobody's touched it since." She kept reorganizing. "Could it be cleared? 3 or 4 of the boys could do it in a day, if anyone asked them to." "I'll ask Mr. Hawthorne." Gerald nodded, drank his coffee, looked like he was going to leave, then didn't. "The men," he said, "they're eating better. They're eating what they should have been eating all along. Previous arrangements weren't what they should have been." She glanced at him. "How long did the supplies feel short to you?" He looked at her over the rim of his cup. It was the first time she'd seen him look directly at anyone with that kind of attention. "Going on 8 months," he said. "Give or take." 8 months. She filed that away carefully. "Why didn't you say something to Mr. Hawthorne?" Gerald set the cup down, looked at the window. "Tried once. Victor told him it was fluctuating seasonal costs. Mr. Hawthorne he wasn't in a state to question it. His wife had just gone." She understood that. Grief made people easy to mislead, not because they were stupid, but because they were already using everything they had just to keep standing. The details fell away. The numbers stopped meaning anything. You signed what was put in front of you because signing it was the only forward motion available. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. He left without any more ceremony than that. She liked him for it. That evening, she went to Nathaniel about the garden. She kept it practical: cost reduction, fresher produce, reduced reliance on deliveries. She didn't mention Gerald, or the 8 months, or any of the other things collecting in her notebook. He agreed without much deliberation, which told her 2 things. He trusted her judgment faster than she'd expected, and he wasn't paying close enough attention to the estate to realize that a garden revival meant she'd be reducing supply orders, which meant she'd have a cleaner baseline to compare against whatever was in those delivery records. She went back to the kitchen and added a line to her notebook. Lydia appeared in this kitchen again on the 5th day. Not at night this time, mid-morning, while Eliza was rolling out pastry dough. The child came in the same way she always came in, like a shadow that had decided to try walking upright, and she stood near the door and watched. Eliza didn't stop rolling. "Do you like apples?" she asked. Nothing from Lydia. "I'm making a pie. I found apples in the cellar that nobody told me about, which means either nobody remembered they were there or someone was saving them for something and then forgot to be saving them." She pressed the dough into the pan and trimmed the edges. Either way, they're better used than wasted. She heard Lydia move, a small shift of weight, feet on the floor. "You can sit at the table if you want," Eliza said. "I'm not going to put you to work. I'm also not going to talk at you. I just thought you might want to watch." A long pause. Then the sound of the stool being pulled out and the creak of it as Lydia sat down. Eliza kept working. She talked about the apples, where they came from, how you could tell a good apple from one that was going to be mealy inside, the fact that the best pies were never made from perfect apples because perfect apples didn't have enough character. She talked about pastry dough and the difference between cold butter and warm butter,
and why the temperature mattered more than most people thought. She did not ask Lydia any questions. She did not look at her with the specific, painful hopefulness that adults aimed at grieving children.
She just worked and talked in the way she'd talk to herself, because she often did talk to herself in kitchens, and because she suspected that Lydia needed, more than anything, to be in the presence of someone who wasn't trying to fix her. When the pie was in the oven, Eliza finally looked over. Lydia was watching her with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite trust, not quite anything that had a name yet, but her hands were folded on the table and her posture had lost some of that careful stillness. She looked for the first time like a child sitting in a kitchen, rather than a ghost haunting one. "It'll be about an hour," Eliza said. "You're welcome to come back for a slice. Or not. Up to you." She turned back to the counter and started on the bread. Lydia left 10 minutes later without a word, but she came back for the pie. The delivery wagon came every Tuesday. Eliza started meeting it at the gate on her second Tuesday, which was the delivery driver's third Tuesday in a row of seeing a new face at Ravenwood, and he had the expression of a man recalibrating. His name was Patterson. He ran supplies for 3 ranches on the Clearwater Circuit, and he had the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing the same route for years and liked it that way. He handed over the manifest. She signed for the delivery, and then she counted every single item in the wagon bed against what the manifest said. Patterson watched this with what she could only describe as careful neutrality. "Previous cook didn't do this," he said, on the first Tuesday. "Previous cook is gone," she said, not looking up from the crates. 40-pound sack of cornmeal, she said. Manifest says 45. Patterson looked at his own copy. "Must be a counting error on the pack end." "Must be," she said. "I'll note it. Same thing last month?" He shifted. "I wouldn't know about last month. I just deliver." "Of course," she said. "I'll track it going forward." She wrote it in the notebook. Not the ranch's record book, her own. The one Victor Hale didn't know existed. On the second Tuesday, the sack of cornmeal was correct, but the salt delivery was 3 pounds short. On the third Tuesday, the lamp oil was under by a full quart. Each shortage was small. Each one was explainable. Each one was consistent. She said nothing to Nathaniel. She said nothing to Victor. She just counted and wrote and waited. What she was building was a pattern, and patterns needed time. You couldn't show someone a single off-key note and call it a problem. You needed to play enough of the song that the wrong notes started to stand out by themselves. She was also watching Victor Hale. Not obviously. She'd learned years ago that obvious watching made people careful, and careful people were harder to read. She watched him the way she watched her stove, peripheral, continuous, noting the small things. The fact that he always seemed to know when Patterson's wagon had arrived before anyone told him. The fact that he spent time in the storage barn at irregular hours, which the ranch hands mentioned in the casual, unguarded way that people mention things they don't think are important. The fact that when she'd asked him last week for the previous year's delivery contracts, specifically the ones from the supplier in Clearwater, he'd said they were being reorganized and he'd get them to her, and then hadn't. She'd asked once more, briefly, and he'd smiled his correct smile and said he hadn't forgotten. He hadn't produced them. She didn't ask a third time. 3 asks, and you were either getting what you wanted or you were telling someone you were suspicious. She'd wait and find another way in. The garden came back slowly. 3 of the ranch hands spent a full day clearing the east plot, pulling weeds, turning soil, uncovering the remains of what had been a genuinely impressive kitchen garden before it was left to collapse. She found the remnants of an herb section along the east wall, a deep bed that had once held tomatoes, and a small area near the fence where someone had planted lavender, which had survived the neglect better than anything else and come back on its own. She was out there in the late afternoon supervising the final clearing when she heard the sound from the direction of the house. She looked up. Nathaniel's father was standing on the back porch. She'd heard about him but hadn't met him. Emmett Hawthorne, 72 years old, who had apparently retreated to his room in the upper part of the house sometime after his daughter-in-law's death and hadn't come down with any regularity since. She'd been leaving a tray outside his door twice a day, which was the system the previous cook had established, and which she'd continued because nobody had told her to do otherwise. He was a tall man, or had been. Age had compressed him slightly, and he moved with the slow deliberateness of someone whose body had developed opinions about certain activities. He wore a shirt and suspenders, no jacket, and he was looking at the garden with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. She left the hands to their work and crossed the yard. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, when she was close enough. She didn't specify which one, but she figured context would do the work. He looked at her. His eyes were clear. That surprised her. She'd half expected someone who had gone vague with age and grief, but his eyes were sharp and taking her in with something close to assessment. "You're the new cook," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected, still carrying the residue of a man used to being heard across distances. "I am. Eliza Whitmore." He looked back at the garden. "That was Helen's," he said. "My daughter-in-law. She planted that herself, first year she came to Ravenwood." Eliza said nothing. She didn't fill the silence. "Nathaniel haven't set foot in it since she passed," Emmett said. "Didn't think anyone would clear it." "It was going to waste," she said. "The herbs alone will cut our supply costs through summer." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, more the ghost of approval. "Practical," he said. "I try to be." "You're leaving trays outside my door." "The arrangement that was in place when I arrived." "I don't need trays," he said. "I'm not an invalid." "Then come to the table," she said simply. He stared at her. She had the feeling no one had said that to him quite so plainly in a long time. People had probably tiptoed around him, offered carefully, given him every opportunity to say no. She didn't see the use in that. "Supper's at 6, she said. "There's no obligation, but the food is better at the table than it is on a tray, and the company might be also." She went back to the garden. She heard him on the porch for a few more minutes. Then she heard the door. He didn't come to supper that night, or the next. But on the third night, she heard the stairs, and then she heard the chair at the far end of the dining room table move, and when she came out with the first dish, she found Emmett Hawthorne sitting there, straight-backed, hands on the table, looking like a man who had decided something and wasn't going to explain his reasoning. Nathaniel looked up from his own end of the table. Something moved across his face, too quick and too private for her to read. And then he said, "Father," in a voice that was careful in the way that voices are when they're trying not to break. "Don't make a fuss," Emmett said. Nobody made a fuss. Eliza served supper and went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and let out a long, slow breath that she hadn't known she'd been holding. 3 weeks in, she had enough. Not enough to prove anything to a judge or a sheriff. She understood that kind of proof took a different architecture than what she'd built so far. But enough to know, with the certainty that came from months of sitting with numbers, that what she was looking at was not accident or error or the loose accounting of a busy ranch. It was deliberate. The shortfalls in the deliveries were too consistent and too well-spaced to be mistakes. They varied just enough, month to month, that no single one ever looked significant. But when you laid them end to end over 6 months, which she had now done, in her notebook 3 times, they added up to a sum that made her sit very still for a while after she'd written it down. The question was where the missing supplies were going. And the second question, which she was only beginning to understand, was whether Patterson, the delivery driver, was part of it or just the mechanism. Whether the supplies were being shorted at the source or somewhere between the source and her notebook. She needed the original contracts, the ones from the supplier. Victor's copies were no use because Victor's copies were the ones she didn't trust. She thought about this for several days. Then Lydia solved it for her, without meaning to. They'd developed a quiet routine by then, the two of them. Lydia came to the kitchen most mornings now, sat at the table, and watched Eliza work. Some days she brought things, a book she was reading, once a drawing she'd made that she set on the table and then appeared to forget about. She still didn't talk much, but she had begun to answer direct questions with 1 or 2 words, which Eliza treated as the considerable progress it was. On the morning in question, Lydia came in earlier than usual, before the hands' breakfast, and she had something in her hands, a small piece of paper, folded. "Found it," she said. Her voice was still the voice of a child who hadn't used it much recently, slightly rougher than it should have been, like a mechanism that needed oil. "Found what?" Eliza asked, without stopping the biscuit assembly. "In the hallway." Lydia set it on the table. "By Victor's office. It fell out of something." Eliza waited until the biscuits were in the oven. Then she picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a receipt from the Clearwater supplier, dated 3 months ago. And the numbers on it, the actual delivered quantities, did not match what Victor's record showed had been delivered that month. The quantities on this receipt were higher, meaning the supplier had sent the correct amount, meaning the shortfall happened somewhere between the supplier's wagon and Ravenwood's pantry. She stood very still for a moment. Then she refolded the paper and looked at Lydia, who was watching her with those careful eyes. "Thank you," Eliza said. "Is it important?" She thought about the right answer to that question when it was being asked by a 9-year-old whose father's ranch was being quietly robbed by the man he trusted most. "It might be," she said. "I'll look into it. Did you show this to anyone else?" Lydia shook her head. "Good. Let's keep it between us for now." Lydia looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the gravity of a child who understood that some things were for keeping. Eliza put the receipt in her coat pocket, next to the notebook. Victor came to find her that afternoon. She was in the pantry when she heard him in the kitchen, and she came out with a jar of preserves in her hands and her face completely ordinary. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I wanted to apologize about those contracts I mentioned. I've been reorganizing the records and they got buried. I should have them for you by end of week." "No hurry," she said, setting the jar on the shelf. He watched her for a moment. "Everything's going well? The kitchen's settling in?" "Very well," she said. "I'm finding my way around the systems." "Good." He smiled the smile. "If you have any questions about how things have been running, I'm always available." "I appreciate that," she said. He left. She waited until she was sure he was gone. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and opened her notebook and looked at everything she'd written over 3 weeks. The patterns, the shortfalls, the gaps between what the delivery manifest said and what actually appeared in the pantry. The receipt in her pocket, the supplier contracts that kept failing to materialize. The picture was almost complete. She could see the broad shape of it, the systematic skimming, the careful spacing, the way it had been designed to look like nothing more than the ordinary inefficiency of a struggling ranch. She could see that it had been going on for a long time, longer than 6 months probably, and that it was not something that happened by itself. Someone was directing it, and that someone, she was now fairly certain, was not acting alone. Because the quantities involved, even accumulated over a year, were significant, but not enough to explain where the real money was going. The supply theft was part of something, the visible part, the part meant to weaken the ranch, to make it look financially failing, to create the conditions for something larger. She didn't know yet what the larger thing was. But she knew someone in Clearwater did. She thought of Silas Crow, walking into the employment office like he owned it. She thought of the way he'd handed the clerk that folded paper. Casual, certain, the gesture of a man accustomed to arranging things. She thought of the word she'd heard since arriving at Ravenwood, mentioned by Gerald in one of the hands, and once by Nathaniel himself in a way that was careful enough to mean something, that there were buyers circling the territory. Men with money who wanted land and were willing to wait for ranchers to fail before they moved. The theft wasn't about the supplies. The theft was about Ravenwood's books, about making the numbers say the ranch was failing so that when someone came with an offer, low, insulting, framed as generosity, Nathaniel would have no choice but to accept. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to start on supper, because the hands needed to eat and the world didn't pause for revelations. She was at the stove when Lydia came in again, this time carrying the book she'd been reading, a battered copy of something with the cover half gone. She sat at the table without asking and opened it and read. And the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of cooking and the occasional turn of a page, and Eliza thought about theft and evidence and the particular patience required to dismantle something that had been built carefully by people who knew what they were doing. She thought, you can't rush this. You can't bring a half-built case to a man who trusted someone for years and expect him to believe you. You need all of it. Every number, every receipt, every piece of the pattern laid out so clearly that the only thing left is the truth. She stirred the pot. Lydia turned a page. Outside, the Montana evening was settling over Ravenwood, the light going gold, then amber, then the particular blue that came just before dark. The garden was cleared now, the soil turned and waiting. The kitchen was orderly and clean and smelled like food, real food, the kind that people ate and felt the difference of. The ranch was not yet saved. There was still something wrong at its center, still something working against it from inside and possibly from outside, still a plan in motion that Eliza hadn't yet fully mapped. But she was closer. Every day she was closer. And the thing she had learned over years of working in kitchens where problems had to be solved with whatever was available was that closer was always enough to keep going on. She kept going. The contracts arrived on a Wednesday. Not from Victor. She'd stopped waiting for Victor. They came from Patterson, the delivery driver, who appeared at the kitchen door that morning with a folded envelope and an expression that said he'd been thinking about something for a while and had finally made a decision about it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She was elbow-deep in bread dough. She didn't stop. "Mr. Patterson, you're not due until Tuesday." "I know it." He turned the envelope in his hands. He was a big man, Patterson, broad across the shoulders, weathered in the way that men who spent their lives outdoors went weathered, with the particular discomfort of someone who was about to do something that felt right but also felt dangerous. "I've been thinking about those counting errors you noted." She looked up. "I want you to understand," he said, "that I deliver what I'm given. What's on the wagon is what the supplier loads. I'm not involved in what happens between the warehouse and the manifest." "I understand that," she said, "but I've been doing this route for 4 years." He set the envelope on the counter. "And the manifest started changing about 10 months ago. Small things. The way the quantities were written up. I thought it was a bookkeeping shift at the supplier's end." He stopped. "I'm not sure I thought it hard enough." She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the envelope. Inside were 3 receipts. Originals, not copies, with the supplier's stamp on each one. 3 months' worth. The quantities on them were unambiguous. "Where did you get these?" she asked. "Kept copies of the originals myself, in case of dispute." He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I'm not a man who wants trouble, Miss Whitmore, but I also don't want to be used for something I don't know about." "You won't be," she said, "and I'll keep your name out of it as long as I can." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and left. She stood at the counter with the 3 receipts in her hands and felt the case she'd been building for a month click into something solid. These were the supplier's originals. Victor's records showed different numbers, smaller ones. The gap between the 2 sets of figures was the proof. Not suggestive, not circumstantial. The kind of documented, datable, signed and stamped proof that didn't leave much room for alternative explanations. She put the receipts with the folded receipt Lydia had found, all of them together in the back of her notebook, and she stood there for a moment thinking about what came next. What came next was the part she hadn't worked out fully yet. She'd been turning it over for days. How to approach Nathaniel. The mechanics of it were not simple. She had a man who had trusted his accountant for years, through the building of his ranch, through the death of his wife, through the worst and most disorienting period of his life. She had evidence that this trusted man had been systematically deceiving him. And she had, underneath all of that, the uncomfortable fact that she was a woman who had been working at Ravenwood for less than a month, whose authority there was still the narrow authority of a cook, and who was about to tell the man who employed her that the man who'd been beside him for years was a thief. She'd seen what happened when this kind of information landed wrong. She'd watched it at the Brennan house years ago, when a ranch hand had accused a fellow worker of stealing, and nobody believed him because the accused man was better liked, and the accuser had ended up leaving. The truth had come out eventually, but the man who'd seen it first had been long gone by then. She did not want to be that man. She needed Nathaniel to find the truth himself, or to find it with her, which was different from being told it. She thought about this for 2 more days. Then Emmett Hawthorne walked into the kitchen on a Saturday morning and poured himself coffee and said without preamble, "You've been quiet this week." She glanced at him. He'd been coming down for meals consistently for 10 days now. Not just supper, but breakfast sometimes, which was not something she'd expected. He sat at the far end of the table mostly, and he talked to Nathaniel in the sparse, careful way of 2 people trying to rebuild a conversation they'd let go cold. But he also talked to her, with a directness she'd come to appreciate. "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She considered. Emmett was sharp, and he had the particular clarity of someone who'd lived long enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. He also had something she needed. He'd been at Ravenwood before Victor Hale, before the thefts, before all of it. He knew the ranch the way you knew your own hands. "How well do you know Victor Hale?" she asked. A pause. He set his cup down. "Who's asking?" "I am." He looked at her for a long moment. "Victor came on 3 years ago. Nathaniel hired him when the records got too complicated to manage alongside everything else. He came with good references. Another pause. From Clearwater. From whom specifically do you know? Emmett's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion toward her, with something else. Memory, maybe, turning over. Clearwater Merchant Association, which Silas Crow chairs. The room was very quiet. Does Nathaniel know that? She asked. Nathaniel hired him. I don't know what he looked at besides the letter. Emmett picked up his cup again, slowly. You want to tell me what you found? She told him. Not everything. She kept the specific figures to herself because figures without the physical documents were just words, and she wasn't ready to have this conversation twice. But she told him about the pattern, the consistent shortfalls, the supplier receipts that didn't match Victor's records, the missing contracts that Victor had been promising for weeks. Emmett listened without interrupting. This was, she had come to understand, one of his qualities. He listened the way men of his generation listened when they were taking something seriously, which was completely, without performing agreement or disagreement until he'd heard all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. How sure are you? He asked. Sure enough to have built a 4-week record, she said. Not sure enough to know how far it goes or who else is involved. The thefts aren't the main thing. They're designed to make the ranch look like it's failing. Emmett looked at his coffee. So, someone can buy it cheap. That would be my reading. Silas Crow has been after this land for 6 years, Emmett said, with the flatness of a man recalling a long, slow fight. Since before Helen passed. He offered twice. Both times Nathaniel said no. After Helen died, the offers stopped. He looked up. Which I thought meant he'd given up. Or that he'd found a different approach, Eliza said. Emmett set his cup down on the counter with a sound that was louder than he intended. She saw the effort it took him to stay steady. My son, he said, is not going to take this well. No, she agreed. He trusted Victor. I know. It's going to feel like it's going to be another loss. On top of everything else. She didn't argue with that. It was true, and there was no point softening it. But he needs to know, she said. Emmett straightened up to his full height, which even compressed by age was considerable. Yes, he said. He does. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite gratitude, which would have been too simple. Something more complicated. The look of a man who recognized that he should have been watching more carefully and was grateful someone else had been. How do you want to do this? Together, she said. You and me. Tonight, after supper. She spent the rest of that day going over her notebook one more time. She wasn't second-guessing the evidence, she was organizing it, arranging it in the sequence that would be hardest to dismiss, that would build from the smallest piece to the largest in a way that let the shape of it become undeniable before the gut reaction had time to take over. She'd learned this from watching people get told bad news. If you led with the worst thing, the shock closed them off, and you spent the rest of the conversation fighting their defenses instead of helping them see. You had to walk them to it. She laid out the delivery discrepancies first, her own records against the manifests. 6 weeks of her counting against 6 weeks of what arrived in the wagon. Then the supplier receipts Patterson had given her against Victor's numbers for the same months. Then the original receipt Lydia had found. Then the timeline of Victor's failure to produce the original contracts, written out date by date. By the time she finished, the notebook had 23 pages of relevant material. She didn't bring all of it. She brought the essential pieces, organized and annotated, and she put a paper marker at each section so she could find them without fumbling. Then she made supper, good supper, roast chicken, which she'd been saving for a reason she couldn't entirely explain, except that she'd felt the day coming, and she wanted people to have eaten something solid before it arrived. Nathaniel was surprised to see Emmett waiting in the sitting room after supper. He came in from checking on something in the barn, still carrying his jacket, and he stopped in the doorway and took in the two of them, his father in the chair by the window, Eliza standing near the fireplace. And something in his expression recalibrated. "What is this?" he said. Not a question exactly. "Sit down, Nathaniel," Emmett said. Nathaniel looked at Eliza. She kept her face level. He sat down. She talked for 20 minutes. She kept her voice steady and factual, and she watched his face the whole time, not to gauge how he was taking it, but because she needed to know when to slow down and when to keep going. She put the papers in his hands in the order she'd planned, one at a time, giving him a moment with each one. He didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes. At the comparison between Patterson's original receipts and Victor's records, he put his hand flat on the paper and just stared at it. She could see him reading the numbers, reading them again. She could see the moment when the arithmetic became undeniable. "These are the supplier's originals," he said. "Yes." "And these are what Victor logged?" "Yes." He put the papers down on the arm of the chair. "How long?" "The pattern in the records goes back at least 8 months, before I arrived. What I've confirmed personally goes back to the day I started keeping my own count." Nathaniel stood up. She'd been waiting for this. The moment when the body needed to move because sitting still wasn't possible. He walked to the window and stood with his back to them, looking out at the dark yard. "Victor's been with me 3 years," he said. "I know. He was here when he handled everything after she died. Every creditor, every supplier contract, every piece of paperwork. He stopped. "I couldn't look at paperwork for months. He handled all of it." "Yes," Eliza said quietly. "I know that too." Emmett spoke from his chair. "Son, don't!" Nathaniel's voice was sharp, not angry, something rawer than that. "Don't say whatever you're going to say." Emmett went quiet. The fire in the grate made its small sounds. Outside, the wind moved across the yard. Nathaniel stood at the window for a long time, and Eliza let him stand there because she understood that some things needed space before they could be looked at directly. "The money," he finally said. "The shortfall, I've been told, were seasonal variants. The supply costs that kept climbing. That was a combination," she said. "Some real cost increase, some manufactured. The theft from deliveries was designed to create a gap that looks like financial instability. On paper, Ravenwood looks like it's bleeding money with no clear cause." "Which makes it worth less," he said, "to a buyer." She didn't answer. He'd gotten there himself. He turned from the window. His face was the face of a man who had just had a large portion of the past 3 years rewritten in the space of 20 minutes, and it was not a good face to see. The anger was there, but underneath the anger was something more painful. The particular wound of being deceived by someone during the time when you were least able to protect yourself. "What do you need from me?" he said. His voice had shifted, steadied. "I need you to do nothing," she said. "Tonight, tomorrow. I need you to act as though nothing has changed, because if Victor knows we're on to him, he'll move. He'll take whatever he can carry, and he'll be gone before we have enough to present to anyone official." Nathaniel stared at her. "You want me to sit across a table from him?" "Yes." "Knowing what he's done?" "Yes." A long silence. "For how long?" "A few more days," she said. "I need to get into the storage records he keeps in the barn office. I believe there are more documents there, the kind that would show not just the supply theft, but the communication with whoever is directing this from Clearwater." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Crow. "I believe so, but I need documentation, not belief." He turned to look at Emmett, who had been sitting quietly through all of this with the expression of a man who was angry and was choosing not to be, because anger wasn't useful right now. "She's right," Emmett said. "You do this wrong, and Crow walks away clean." Nathaniel ran a hand over his face. It was the first unguarded gesture she'd seen from him. The collapse of the composure he'd been maintaining since she arrived, the momentary dropping of all the weight he was carrying. "All right," he said. "What do we do?" The barn office was a small room off the main barn, really just a converted tack room with a desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet that had been dragged in from somewhere at some point. Victor used it to keep the physical supply records, the ones that didn't live in the house. Eliza had known about it from Gerald, who'd mentioned it without knowing he was giving her something useful. She went in at 3 in the morning when the ranch was as close to silent as it ever got, with the lamp turned low and her notebook and the specific practiced calm of a woman who had made a decision and was no longer afraid of it. Victor kept the room locked. She'd expected this. What she hadn't expected was how straightforward the lock was. A simple padlock of the kind you could find in any hardware store, which could be opened with the right piece of wire if you'd spent 3 years at a logging camp where the equipment shed lock broke regularly and the maintenance man was perpetually unavailable. She was inside in 4 minutes. The filing cabinet held 6 months of physical records, organized the way Victor organized everything. Neatly, precisely, in a way that under normal circumstances would have looked like the work of a thorough and reliable man. She went through it methodically, starting at the back, which was where the oldest records lived. She found the correspondence on the third drawer. It was tucked inside a folder labeled Vendor Correspondence Clearwater, which was accurate as far as it went. There were letters from the supplier, letters from Patterson's transport company, and underneath all of them, 6 letters on paper with a different letterhead. Not a business letterhead, personal stationery, initialed rather than named in full. SC. She read the first one standing at the desk, holding the lamp close. It was careful. The language was oblique in the way that careful men make language oblique when they don't want to put certain words in writing. But the meaning was plain if you knew what you were looking at. A schedule, supply reduction targets, a timeline, and at the bottom, a figure, a purchase price, written as a projected acquisition value, which was the language of a man who had decided the purchase was already done and was only waiting for the owner to realize it. She read all 6 letters. Each one was dated. Each one moved the timeline forward. The most recent was from 6 weeks ago, 2 weeks before she'd arrived at Ravenwood. It referenced the anticipated conclusion, which meant that 6 weeks ago, someone had believed the ranch was close enough to financial collapse that the offer would come soon. She copied the relevant details into her notebook. Dates, figures, the specific language that tied the letters to the supply manipulation. She didn't take the originals. She needed them to stay where they were, where Victor would assume they were safe. Taking them would tell him someone had been here. She put everything back in the order she'd found it. She was out of the barn office in just under an hour. She walked back to the house in the dark, the Montana night enormous above her, the lamp out now so she was just a shape moving across the yard. Her hands were steady. Her mind was the clearest it had been in weeks. She had everything. What? She told Nathaniel and Emmett in the morning in the kitchen while Lydia was still asleep. She laid out what she'd found in the same organized way she'd laid out everything else. Nathaniel listened with the particular stillness of a man who has already absorbed the worst and is now simply taking in the confirmation of it. 6 letters, he said. 6 that I found. There may be more, verbal agreements, things not written down, but 6 is enough. Emmett looked at Nathaniel. You could ride to the county seat today, Sheriff Abrams. Not yet, Eliza said. They both looked at her. She'd thought this through in the hour before dawn, and she'd come to the conclusion that troubled her most, the one she'd been resisting for 2 days because it required something she wasn't sure Nathaniel was ready for. If we go to the sheriff now, Victor gets arrested, and Crow's letters are evidence, but Crow himself was careful, she said. The language in those letters is oblique. His name isn't signed in full. His involvement is clear to anyone who reads them in context, but a good lawyer could argue coincidence. Crow has money for good lawyers. So he walks, Nathaniel said flatly. He might. Or he faces a lesser charge and pays a fine and tries the same approach somewhere else in a year. She paused. But if Victor gives a full account, names Crow directly, describes the arrangement, confirms the amounts, then there's no ambiguity. Victor is not going to confess, Nathaniel said. Not to you, she said, and not if he feels cornered. She looked at him steadily. But he might, if someone showed him that Crow was going to let him fall alone. Silence. You want to talk to him, Emmett said. I want to be the one who talks to him, she said. Not you, Nathaniel. You can't. The anger will be too visible, and he'll go defensive before he hears anything. He needs to hear it from someone who isn't his enemy, someone who's simply laying out his options. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Why would you do that? It was a genuine question, not suspicious, just honest. The question of a man trying to understand what was in front of him. Because I've been watching Victor Hale for a month, she said, and he's not a man who set this up himself. He's a man who got pulled into it and kept going because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing, which means there's a part of him that knows how this ends if he doesn't change course. She paused. I want to talk to that part. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. She found Victor into the barn office the next afternoon, which was where he went most afternoons. She knocked on the door frame. The door was open, and came in without waiting to be invited. He looked up. Something moved behind his eyes when he saw her, but his face assembled itself quickly. Something I can help you with? She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She hadn't brought the notebook or the receipts or any of the documents. This conversation needed to happen without paper, at least at the start. I want to tell you something, she said, and I want you to listen before you decide how to respond. He put his pen down. His expression was careful. I've been going through the supply records since I arrived, she said. I've built a picture of what's been happening with the deliveries. I have the supplier's original receipts for the past 3 months. I have my own daily records going back 6 weeks. I have the correspondence from the barn office. His face went still. Not blank, still. The particular stillness of someone who has just heard something they were hoping not to hear and is calculating very quickly. I know what that correspondence contains, she said. And I know that if it goes to the authorities as it stands, with no context and no account, the man whose initials are on those letters will have lawyers working before sundown. And the man who carried out the arrangement on his behalf, the one whose name is on the actual supply contracts and the actual delivery logs, will not. Victor looked at her. He was very quiet. I'm not here because I want to destroy you, she said. I'm here because you're about to be left holding everything while someone else walks away from it, and I don't think you've let yourself understand that yet. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice was wrong. There was no conviction in it. It was the voice of a man saying words because the silence was worse. Tell me I'm wrong, she said. Show me where my math doesn't add up. He didn't. She leaned forward slightly. He came to you, she said. Crow. He didn't ask you to do something you'd planned yourself. He came with a proposal and a reason. And you needed something. Money, maybe. Or protection from something. I don't know what. And the thing he was asking seemed small enough at the beginning that you said yes. She paused. And then it wasn't small anymore, and you'd already said yes, and stopping felt impossible. Victor's hands were flat on the desk. She watched his breathing. Did I miss anything? She said. A very long silence. My brother, he said. His voice had changed, gone quieter, gone in some way more real. 3 years ago. He had debts. Crow held the notes. He told me, he said if I helped manage things at Ravenwood, facilitate the transition, the debts would be cleared. He stopped. That was how he said it. Facilitate the transition. And the debts? Paid. First year. He looked down at his hands. By then I was in it. Too far into, the amounts I'd moved, the records I'd altered. If it came out, everything came out. It's going to come out, she said. Flat, not cruel, just true. What you control now is the version that comes out. Whether it's the version where Crow's involvement is buried and you carry all of it, or the version where you give a full account and Crow's own letters confirm your testimony. Victor looked at her. His face, stripped of its careful pleasantness, was the face of a man who was very tired. Not morally bankrupt. That, she thought, would have been easier. Just tired. The tiredness of someone who had been living inside a bad decision for 3 years and hadn't slept well in most of them. Nathaniel, he said, he's not going to be easy, she said. No, but Nathaniel Hawthorne is a man who values the truth over his own comfort. You've worked with him for 3 years, you know that. Victor closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had settled. What happens, he said, if I tell it? I can't promise you anything specific, she said. I'm a cook, not a judge. But I know that the man who names Crow and gives documented testimony is not the same man as the one who stays quiet and lets the evidence speak for itself. Courts understand the difference. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. Outside, the sound of the ranch going about its afternoon, hooves in the yard, someone calling to someone else across the barn, the ordinary working noise of a place that was still alive. I need to talk to Nathaniel, Victor said finally. Yes, she said. You do. She stood. At the doorway she paused because there was one more thing. Victor, she said, those families in Clearwater that Crow has been targeting alongside Ravenwood, the smaller operations, do you know which ones? He looked up. Something in his face changed. A recognition, she thought, that the consequences of all this went further than one ranch and one man's grief. I have a list, he said quietly. He gave it to me. Sent it with the last letter. Priority acquisition targets, he called them. I'd like that list, she said. He opened the top drawer of his desk and looked for a moment.
Then he took out a folded paper and held it out. She crossed back to the desk and took it. 5 names. 5 ranches in the Clearwater Valley. 5 families who didn't know they were on anyone's list. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said. She left the barn office and walked back across the yard in the afternoon light, and she thought about 5 families who were about to find out someone had been trying to take everything from them. She thought about Nathaniel standing at his window in the dark, rearranging the last 3 years. She thought about Emmett and the garden and Lydia's bare feet on the kitchen floor. She thought, this is not done yet. Victor confessing is not the same as Crow being stopped, but it was the next piece. And she had learned, in a life spent solving problems with whatever was available, that the next piece was always enough. You picked it up. You kept going. You didn't wait for the whole picture before you moved, because the whole picture only existed in retrospect, and retrospect was a luxury that problems rarely granted while they were still happening. She went back to the kitchen. Lydia was at the table with her book, feet tucked under her on the stool, reading in the long afternoon light. "Apple or rhubarb," Eliza said, going to the stove. Lydia looked up. "For what?" "Pie. Tomorrow. I need to decide tonight whether to pull from the cellar or the garden." Lydia considered this with appropriate gravity. "Apple," she said. "Rhubarb is too sour." "Rhubarb is only sour if you don't know what you're doing with it," Eliza said. "But noted." Lydia almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The corner of her mouth moved in a way that had the shape of something lighter than anything Eliza had seen on that face in 5 weeks. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening. In the barn office, Victor Hale was sitting with the weight of a decision he should have made 3 years ago. In the house, Nathaniel Hawthorne was waiting for something he didn't know yet was coming. In Clearwater, Silas Crow was still certain, she imagined, that everything was going according to plan. He was wrong about that. But he didn't know it yet. Soon, he would. Victor came to the house that evening. He knocked at the front door, which nobody used. Everyone at Ravenwood came and went through the side or the back, the way working people use working entrances. The front door knock was deliberate, Eliza thought. It was the knock of a man who had decided to do something formal and was marking the occasion in the only way available to him. Nathaniel answered it himself. Eliza stayed in the kitchen. She'd discussed this with Emmett an hour earlier, that the conversation between Nathaniel and Victor needed to happen without her in the room because her presence would change the architecture of it. Victor needed to confess to the man he'd wronged, not to the woman who'd caught him. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. Emmett sat at the kitchen table with her, drinking coffee he didn't particularly want, and they listened to the sound of 2 men's voices from the sitting room. Not the words, just the cadence of them. The long silences. The moments when one voice rose slightly and then came back down. The particular quality of a conversation that is costing both participants something significant. It went on for nearly 2 hours. Lydia had been put to bed before Victor arrived. Eliza had seen to that, steering her toward the stairs with the gentle firmness she'd developed over weeks of managing a child who resisted being managed. Lydia had gone without protest, which meant she'd understood something was happening even if she didn't know what. She was good at reading a room, that child. Better than most adults. At some point during the second hour, Emmett got up and poured himself something stronger than coffee. He stood at the counter and didn't offer Eliza any, and she didn't ask. And they stayed in the kitchen together in a sense that had become, over the past weeks, surprisingly comfortable. When the sitting room door finally opened, Emmett straightened. Eliza kept her hands around her cup. Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked like a man who had just come through something physical, not injured, but spent, in the way that hard emotional labor spends you. His face was composed, but the composition was effortful. You could see the work in it. "He's going to the sheriff," Nathaniel said. "Tomorrow morning. He'll make a full statement." Eliza nodded. "He wants to ride out tonight, sleep somewhere else." Nathaniel's jaw tightened briefly. "I told him he could take one of the horses." "That was right," Emmett said. Nathaniel looked at his father. Something moved between them. Not words, just the current of 2 people who had been through a great deal and were still, despite everything, standing in the same room. "He told me things," Nathaniel said, "about the last year and a half. Things he handled after Helen died that I wasn't—" He stopped. I didn't ask enough questions. You were grieving, Eliza said. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed. It's not an excuse. It's a reason. There's a difference. He looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that held more than the moment it occupied. She didn't look away from it. I owe you something, he said. You pay my wage, she said. That covers it. He almost said something else. Then he didn't, and he went back into the hall, and she heard his boots on the stairs going up. Emmett stood at the counter and finished his drink. He's going to be all right, he said. It was hard to tell whether he was saying it to her or to himself. He is, she said, and she meant it, because she'd been watching Nathaniel Hawthorne for 5 weeks, and she understood by now that he was the kind of man who bent badly under grief and straightened slowly and held once he was upright again. Emmett put his glass in the basin and went to bed. Eliza sat alone in the kitchen for a while, in the particular quiet of a house where something difficult had just happened and the air hadn't quite settled back to normal yet. Then she pulled the folded list from her coat pocket, the 5 names Victor had given her, and looked at it again. 5 ranches. 5 families who thought they were simply struggling, the way everyone struggled on the frontier, without knowing they were being helped toward failure. She put the list on the table and looked at it for a long time. Sheriff Dale Abrams was a practical man, which was the best and possibly only thing you could say about him on first meeting. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, thick-built, with a face that had stopped being surprised by things years ago and now simply received information with the flat patience of someone filling out a long form. He came to Ravenwood 2 days after Victor's statement, riding out with a deputy, and arriving in the late morning when Eliza was in the garden, doing the kind of work that needed doing, regardless of what else was happening, weeding, because the weeds didn't care about Silas Crow or supply theft or the legal architecture of land fraud. Nathaniel brought the sheriff inside. Eliza left the garden, washed her hands at the outside pump, and came in through the back. Abrams was at the dining room table with the documents spread in front of him. Her organized summary, Victor's written statement, Patterson's original receipts, the 6 letters from the barn office. He was reading carefully, turning pages with the methodical deliberateness of someone who'd learned that hurrying through evidence was how you missed things. He looked up when she came in. "You put this together," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I organized it," she said. The documents organized themselves. A pause that might have been appreciation from a man who probably didn't often express it. "You have any legal background?" "No, I'm a cook." He looked back at the papers. Then, the letters. The initials SC. You're confident that's Silas Crow. "Victor Hale has named him directly in his written statement," she said. "The initials, the personal stationery, the reference to Clearwater acquisition targets, taken together with Victor's account. Yes. Crow's going to say the letters are circumstantial. Crow's going to say whatever his lawyers tell him to say," Eliza said. But Victor's statement describes 4 meetings in Clearwater over 3 years, dates, locations, specific amounts discussed. One of those meetings was at Crow's own office, witnessed by Crow's personal secretary. She'd gotten this detail from Victor the previous morning. One last conversation in the barn before he rode out, during which she'd asked every question she could think of and written down every answer. A secretary who presumably kept her own records. Abrams looked at her over the papers. "You've thought this through." "I've had a month of quiet evenings," she said. He almost smiled. "The list of other properties. 5 ranches. All in the Clearwater Valley. All showing similar financial pressure. I don't have their records, obviously, but the pattern Victor described for Ravenwood would apply to any operation Crow had compromised. Those families don't know." "No," she said. "They don't." Abrams gathered the papers into a careful stack. "I'll need to ride to the county seat. This is above Clearwater's jurisdiction. Crow has friends on the town council, and I'd rather have the county prosecutor handle it from the start." He looked at Nathaniel. "Don't move the documents. I'll send someone for them." "Whatever you need," Nathaniel said. Abrams stood, buttoned his coat. He looked around the dining room at the long table that had recently begun to be used again. There were 3 chairs pulled out at angles that meant people had been sitting in them. He seemed to note this without commenting on it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sheriff. You did good work." He said it simply, the way you stated a fact, and then he put his hat on and left. The days after Abrams rode to the county seat had their own particular quality, tense in the way that waiting is always tense, but with something underneath the tension that was different from what had been there before. The concealment was over. The daily performance of normalcy while carrying a secret had been exhausting in a way Eliza hadn't fully appreciated until she put it down. Without it, she was tired in a straightforward, manageable way. The kind of tired you slept off. Nathaniel rode to Clearwater himself 3 days after Abrams's visit. He didn't tell her where he was going until he was already saddled, which she understood. He needed to do it without being talked out of it or into it. "Crow's office," he said when she came out to the yard. She waited. "I'm not going to threaten him," he said. I know that's not useful. I just need him to know that I know. Before it becomes official. Before his lawyers are between us." He looked out at the road. "I need to look him in the face." She understood that, even if she couldn't fully endorse it as strategy. "Gerald can ride with you," she said. "I'll go alone." "Nathaniel." He looked at her. It was the first time she'd used his given name directly, and they both registered it. "Take Gerald," she said. "Not for protection, for witness." A pause. Then, "All right." He came back that evening with Gerald, and with the particular look of a man who has done something difficult and feels both worse and better for having done it. He didn't tell her what was said in Crow's office. She didn't ask. Some things needed to stay between the people who were in the room, and she'd learned enough about Nathaniel by now to know that he would tell her what she needed to know and hold the rest. What she learned from Gerald, who came to the kitchen for coffee afterward and sat with the loose-shouldered posture of a man processing a long day, was that Crow had said very little, had listened, had thanked them for stopping by, which Gerald described with the wry expression of a man who has seen a certain kind of arrogance up close and is still faintly amazed by it. "He wasn't scared," Gerald said. "He will be," Eliza said. Gerald nodded slowly. "I expect so. Bet." The news from the county seat arrived in pieces over the following 2 weeks, delivered by various writers with various levels of detail. The county prosecutor had opened an investigation. Crow had been contacted. His lawyers had appeared as predicted almost immediately. 2 of the 5 ranches on Victor's list had been notified, quietly, through the sheriff's office, that they were subjects of a land fraud inquiry and that no transactions involving their properties should be completed without county knowledge. The other 3 ranches, the sheriff's deputy told Nathaniel when he rode out with the update, had already been approached with purchase offers in the past month. None had accepted. 2 had come close. Eliza thought about those 2 families, whoever they were, in the valley she hadn't seen, on land they'd built, and didn't know someone had been trying to take from them by making their numbers lie. She thought about the specific loneliness of that, the feeling of failing at something you were actually doing right, the way a ranch could look like it was dying when the dying was being manufactured by someone else's hand. She thought, they'll know now. That's something. It wasn't everything. Crow wasn't arrested, not yet, and possibly not for some time. His lawyers were working, and working well, and the county prosecutor had warned Nathaniel that a case of this complexity would move slowly. Victor's testimony was valuable, but not bulletproof. The letters were strong, but the language was deliberately careful. There would be a long fight. Nathaniel had accepted this. What he hadn't expected, what none of them had fully anticipated, was the speed at which the other 4 ranchers came to him. It started with a man named Rupert Calloway, who rode in on a gray morning 2 weeks after the investigation opened. He was a lean man in his 60s, wind-scoured, with the look of someone who had built everything he owned with his own hands and was still not entirely comfortable sitting still. He tied his horse at the post and came to the front door and knocked, and Nathaniel brought him in, and they sat in the dining room for an hour. Eliza heard none of this, but afterward Nathaniel came to the kitchen and stood in the doorway looking like something had shifted in him. Not the raw, disoriented look of the night Victor confessed, but something more settled, purposeful. "Calloway's ranch is 2 valleys over," he said. "He's been dealing with supply shortfalls for 8 months. He thought it was his foreman being sloppy. The foreman thought it was the supplier. Nobody thought to compare the original receipts until the sheriff's deputy showed up and asked. 'How bad?' she said. 'Not as bad as here, but the pattern is the same.' He paused. 'He wants to help. With the case. He has his own records and he's willing to give a statement.'
That's good, she said. That's very good. There are going to be others. The deputy said the other ranchers are talking. He looked at the table, at the list of 5 names that still sat there, that she hadn't put away yet. These aren't just Ravenwood's neighbors. If Crow had succeeded here and at the other 4 ranches, he would have controlled the supply routes for most of the valley. Every small operation within 50 miles would have depended on buyers he approved and suppliers he set prices with. She'd understood this from the beginning, in broad outline. Hearing Nathaniel say it meant he understood it now too.
What do you want to do? She asked. What I want, he said, and what's practical are 2 different things. Tell me both. He looked at her. What I want is to ride to Clearwater and make sure Silas Crow never does business in this territory again. A pause. What's practical is to give the prosecutor everything he needs and let the law do what it's supposed to do and spend the next year rebuilding the ranch's accounts so there's no question about our financial standing when this goes to court. Both of those are good answers, she said. The second one is better. I know. He almost smiled. That ghost of an expression she'd seen a handful of times now, always brief, always real. I know it. What? The day the recovery money came was not dramatic. Eliza had imagined, in some part of her mind she didn't examine too closely, that there would be a clarity to it, a moment of definitive arrival. What actually happened was that a bank official rode out from Clearwater with documents for Nathaniel to sign, and the documents referenced an account that had been frozen as part of the investigation and was now being partially released pending final resolution, and Nathaniel signed them at the dining room table while Emmett sat across from him not reading a newspaper. The full amount wouldn't be recovered. There were legal complexities. Victor's own restitution capacity was limited, and Crow's assets were frozen but contested. But enough came back to matter. Enough to cover the supply costs that had been artificially inflated. Enough to repair 3 things on the ranch that had been deferred because the money wasn't there. Enough to prove, in concrete numerical terms, that the financial distress Ravenwood had appeared to be in was not real. That the ranch was viable, had always been viable, and could demonstrate that to any court that needed to see it. Nathaniel looked at the documents after the bank official left, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, I want to reopen the north pasture. Emmett looked up. Helen always wanted cattle on the north pasture, Nathaniel said. I kept saying we didn't have the resources. We do now. We always did, apparently. Emmett folded his hands on the table. Something in his face, something that had been held tightly for a long time, shifted and loosened a degree. Helen would have had opinions about which cattle, he said. She had opinions about everything, Nathaniel said, and it came out with grief in it, but also something else, something warmer, the way the mention of a person can carry both loss and love in the same sentence if you let it. Eliza heard this from the kitchen doorway where she'd come to ask about supper, and then stopped, and she stood there for a moment, and then went quietly back to the stove. Lydia started talking. Not all at once. It wasn't like that. There was no morning where she woke up and was different. It was gradual, the way most real changes are. A word here, a sentence there, questions that came sideways while she was doing something else, so that the conversation had already started before anyone needed to decide to have it. She asked Eliza about her mother on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the 2 of them were in the kitchen making bread, and the light through the window had gone the particular low gold of autumn. Did she cook? Lydia asked. It took Eliza a moment to understand the question. My mother? Lydia nodded, her small hands working the dough the way Eliza had shown her, push and fold, the motion that looked simple and wasn't. She did, Eliza said. Not well. She paused. She was better at other things. She could sew anything. She could talk anyone into anything. But in the kitchen, she was ambitious. She had ideas that outran her technique. Lydia processed this. Like what? She once tried to make a French dish she'd read about in a magazine. Something with cream and pastry, and I don't remember what else. The pastry caught fire. Not a small fire. We had to take the pan outside. Lydia looked up from the dough. Something moved across her face, the almost smile that Eliza had been watching develop over weeks, becoming more fully itself each time. Did she try again? 3 times, Eliza said. Never got it right. Kept trying anyway. She turned the bread. That was her nature. A pause.
My mother made biscuits, Lydia said, very quietly, like she was testing the weight of the sentence before setting it down. She made them on Sundays. She let me cut them. What shape did you cut them? Rounds, mostly. Sometimes she had a cutter that was shaped like a star. We only used it on special days. Do you know where it is? Lydia looked at her. The cutter? Yes. A moment. Maybe. In one of the boxes in the cellar. If you find it, Eliza said, bring it up. We can use it. Lydia looked at her for a long time. Then she looked down at the dough. Push and fold. She found the cutter 2 days later in a wooden box under the cellar stairs, wrapped in a cloth. She brought it to the kitchen without announcement and set it on the counter, and she stood back from it the way you stand back from something you've retrieved from a long distance. Eliza looked at it. A small tin star, worn at the points, with a wooden handle that had been touched by many hands. Good, she said. We'll use it Sunday. Lydia went back to whatever she'd been doing, but she stood a little differently, just slightly. The posture of someone who has set something down that they'd been carrying a long time. What? Emmett came back to himself slowly, the way a fire comes back when you add good wood to it and give it air. Not in a burst, but steadily, building until it was warm enough to do real work again. He started spending mornings in the yard, which was where Nathaniel spent his mornings, and the two of them would often be found near the fence line or the barn in the early hours, talking. Eliza couldn't hear what they said. She didn't need to. She could see the shape of it from the kitchen window. Two men of different generations, each of whom had retreated in his own way, each of whom was finding his way back to the place he'd left. One morning, Emmett came in from outside and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. "You've done something here," he said. "I work here," she said. "That's not what I said." She was quiet for a moment. "The garden was Helen's," he said. This kitchen was a place this family stopped coming to. I don't know when it happened exactly. After she died. One by one, we stopped coming." He looked at the room around him, the clean counter, the organized shelves, the herbs hanging to dry near the window, the stool where Lydia sat. "You came here and the kitchen became a place again. People came back to it." Eliza didn't know what to say to that. She was not by nature a woman who received this kind of statement gracefully. She tended to deflect or redirect, the way practical people often do when sentiment arrives unexpectedly. "The stove was already here," she said. Emmett looked at her. "That's not what I said either." She turned back to what she was doing, but she felt the words settle somewhere. The hearing was set for the following spring. Word came in late November via a letter from the county prosecutor's office, outlining the formal charges against Silas Crow: fraud, conspiracy to commit land theft, and several related counts that the prosecutor had assembled with what appeared to be quiet thoroughness. Victor's testimony was listed as a primary source. Patterson's receipts were listed as documentary evidence. The 6 letters from the barn were listed as exhibits. Nathaniel read the letter at the breakfast table. Emmett across from him, Lydia beside him eating biscuits cut with the star cutter, which had become the only biscuit cutter used on Sundays. He read it twice. Then he set it down. "Spring," he said. "That's months away," Emmett said. "I know." "Crow's going to try to settle." "He can try." Nathaniel folded the letter. "My answer will be no." Emmett nodded. Lydia looked between them and seemed to understand, in the way she understood things now, that this was something important being resolved. "Will he go to jail?" she asked. Nathaniel looked at his daughter. "The prosecutor thinks so. If they believe the evidence," Emmett said. "They will," said Lydia, with the clear, uncomplicated certainty of a child who has not yet learned to hedge her convictions. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then he reached over and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. An easy gesture, natural, the gesture of a father and daughter who have found their way back to each other through whatever difficult territory they'd crossed. Eliza brought more coffee to the table and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and thought about the spring, about a courtroom in the county seat and a man in a good suit watching his lawyers work, about the 5 families in the valley who now knew what had been done to them, about supply records and original receipts and the specific patient architecture of evidence built over weeks of quiet counting. She thought about the morning she had arrived at Ravenwood, the kitchen as she'd found it,
The dust, the stove, the chaos on the shelves, the whole place breathing the slow exhalation of a household that had stopped believing in itself. She thought, that was 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks. She was still not sure what this place was to her. That question was still open, still being answered one morning at a time. She was a cook. She had a wage and a room and work that needed doing. She had not arrived here expecting anything beyond that, and she was careful, even now, about expecting anything beyond it. But she had also stopped, somewhere in the past few weeks, calculating the distance to the next town. She'd stopped doing the mental arithmetic of someone who is always prepared to move on. How much she'd saved, what positions might be available, which directions were open. That arithmetic had quieted. She wasn't sure exactly when it had stopped. She only knew that it had. Through the window, the November morning sat cold and clear over the Montana Valley, the frost on the grass picking up what light was available and holding it. The north pasture stretched out toward the mountains, empty now, waiting. In the spring there would be cattle there, on land that Helen Hawthorne had looked at years ago and decided was good for something. In the spring there would be a hearing, and evidence presented, and the slow machinery of consequence turned toward a man who had been certain he could take what wasn't his. Eliza turned back to the stove. Gerald came through the back door, stamping his boots, the way he always did, and poured his coffee and leaned against the counter and drank it in the comfortable silence that had developed between them. "Cold this morning," he said. "It'll get colder," she said. He looked out the window. "You staying on through winter?" She kept her eyes on the stove. "Is there a reason I shouldn't be?" He thought about this. "No," he said. "No, I don't suppose there is." She said nothing. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the basin, and went back out. The kitchen was quiet again. From the dining room she could hear the low voices of Nathaniel and Emmett, talking the way they talked now. Easier than before, with less space between the sentences. From upstairs she could hear Lydia moving around, getting herself ready for the day with the independent determination of a child who had decided at some point to start taking up her own space again. Eliza put water on for the midday meal and opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, in her neat, practical hand, December, winter stores, garden cover, north pasture fence assessment. She turned to the next line and kept writing. There was still a great deal of work to do. There always was. That was not a complaint. It was the simple fact of any place worth being in. Places worth being in always had more work than they had time, and the work was never finished, and that was how you knew the place was alive. She kept writing. Outside, the Montana morning kept its cold, clear hold on the valley, and Ravenwood Ranch kept breathing, kept moving, kept being a place where people came back to the table. And the woman who had walked through the gate with a worn suitcase and her last dollar in her shoe sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and her coffee and her lists, and worked because work was what she knew and what she trusted and what had never once, in all her years, let her down. Winter came to Ravenwood the way it always came to that part of Montana, without asking permission and all at once. The first real snow fell in early December, blanketing the yard overnight, and leaving the ranch transformed by morning into something that looked almost peaceful if you didn't know what was underneath it. The frozen fence posts, the ice that formed on the water troughs before the hands could break it, the particular misery of a barn that was warm enough to work in but only barely. Eliza had grown up with Montana winters, and she did not romanticize them. She put extra oil in the lamps, doubled the morning porridge, and started waking at 4 instead of 4:30 because everything took longer in the cold. The work changed but did not stop. It never stopped. She'd learned, over the months she'd been at Ravenwood, to read the ranch's rhythms the way she read a kitchen. What was running well, what was straining, where the pressure points were hiding. By December she knew the names of all 12 hands and their habits, and the particular way each of them ate that told you more about their state of mind than anything they said. She knew that Gerald always took more bread when he was worried about something, and less coffee when he was tired, which seemed counterintuitive until you understood that for Gerald, coffee was a pleasure and not a prop. She knew that the youngest hand, a boy of 17 named Thomas, who'd been taken on in September, ate with the concentrated ferocity of someone who hadn't always had enough and still couldn't quite believe he did. She fed Thomas extra without making it visible. You could do that if you were paying attention. Just a slightly fuller plate, set at his spot before he sat down, so it was simply what was there rather than something being offered. She noticed these things. She always had. It was not a skill anyone had praised her for, because it was the kind of skill that operated below the surface of what people thought to praise, the invisible labor of attention. The letter from the county prosecutor arrived in late January. It was addressed to Nathaniel, and she only knew about it because he brought it to the kitchen that evening and set it on the table and sat down across from her in a way that said he needed another person in the room while he thought it through. She poured coffee and sat down. Crow's lawyers made an offer, he said, through the prosecutor. Full financial restitution to all 5 ranches. An agreement to divest from the Clearwater Merchant Association. No criminal charges. She kept her face still. What did the prosecutor say? That it's my decision whether to accept. The other 4 ranchers defer to me since Ravenwood was the primary target. He turned the letter over in his hands. Crow doesn't want to go to trial. Of course he doesn't, she said. Victor's testimony and those letters would be read in open court. He'd rather settle quietly. The prosecutor thinks we'd win. What do you think? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I think winning at trial takes another year, maybe more. I think my daughter has been watching me carry this for 6 months. I think the ranch needs to move forward. She waited. But I also think, he said, that if Crow pays and walks away, he does this somewhere else. Different valley, different ranches, different families who don't have anyone counting flour sacks. She looked at him. You've already decided. He exhaled. I've already decided. Tell the prosecutor no. Yes. He folded the letter. Yes. She stood up and went back to the stove because there wasn't anything else to say about it, and he didn't need anything else from her. He'd made the right call. He knew it, and she knew it. Sometimes that was the whole of what needed to happen in a conversation. He stayed at the table for a while longer, drinking his coffee, and then he went upstairs. She heard him stop in the hallway outside Lydia's room, the particular pause of a parent checking on a child through a closed door, and then continue to his own room. She washed the cups and thought about a man in Clearwater who was going to face a jury in the spring, and who had been certain, once, that he could take whatever he wanted from people who were too tired or too grieving or too small to stop him. He'd been wrong about that. The trial began on a Thursday in late April, when the valley had finally committed to spring and the mud season was underway. That specific Montana condition where the ground couldn't decide whether to be frozen or thawed and ended up being both at once, treacherously. Nathaniel rode to the county seat with Emmett and Gerald. Eliza stayed at Ravenwood. This was her choice, and she'd made it clearly when Nathaniel asked. She was not a witness. She'd given her written account to the prosecutor months ago, a careful document that laid out everything she'd found and how she'd found it, which the prosecutor had read and then looked up at her and said, with the expression of a man genuinely startled, that it was the most organized submission he'd seen from a civilian in 20 years of practice. She had nothing to add in person, and someone needed to keep the ranch running. More than that, she didn't need to be there. She'd done the work that had made the trial possible. Whether she watched the conclusion unfold was beside the point. She was not in the habit of needing to see the end of a thing to know it had ended. Lydia stayed too, by her own request. On the first day of the trial, the 2 of them spent the morning in the garden, the spring garden, which was already showing life after the winter cover Eliza had laid in November. They worked alongside each other in the easy, unpretentious way they'd developed over months, with Lydia asking questions that were sometimes about gardening and sometimes about other things entirely, slipping between topics the way children did when they were actually comfortable. What if he doesn't get found guilty? Lydia asked. She was crouched over a row of early peas, checking the seedlings with a seriousness that would not have been out of place on a much older face. Then the evidence wasn't enough to convince the jury, Eliza said. But the evidence was enough. We have everything. Having everything and convincing 12 strangers are different problems. Lydia sat back on her heels and thought about this. That doesn't seem right. No, Eliza agreed. It doesn't. That's one of the true things about the world that takes some getting used to. Did you always know that? No, I learned it. She turned the soil at the edge of the bed. I used to think that if you were right about something, other people would see it, that the truth would just announce itself. She paused. It doesn't work like that. The truth has to be organized, presented, given the right conditions to be seen. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Is that why you kept the notebook? Partly. She glanced over. And partly because I can only hold so many numbers in my head at once. Lydia almost laughed. It was close, the exhaled breath of it, the shape of it in her face. She was doing that more often now, almost laughing, and each time it happened, it felt like a measurement of something that was slowly returning. The verdict came back on the 5th day. A writer brought it to Ravenwood ahead of Nathaniel, which meant Eliza knew before he arrived. The writer was Thomas, the young hand, who had apparently been in town when the news came out and had ridden back at a pace that suggested he understood the importance of being the one who delivered good news. Guilty, he said, breathless, at the kitchen door. All main counts. Crow's to be sentenced next month. Eliza nodded. Thank you, Thomas. There's pie on the counter. He came in and had 2 slices standing up, still in his coat, still flushed from the ride. She went to find Lydia. She was upstairs in her room, sitting at her window the way she'd been doing since her father left, watching the road. She'd been doing it quietly, without drama, the vigil of a child who had lost someone before and was not taking the continued presence of the people she loved for granted. Eliza knocked on the open door. Your father will be home by evening, she said. The verdict came in. Lydia turned from the window. Her face asked the question before she could. Guilty, Eliza said. Lydia turned back to the window for a moment. Then she said quietly, Good. In the voice of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. Nathaniel came home at dusk. He came into the kitchen first before he'd even taken off his coat, and he stood in the middle of the room and looked around at it, at the lit stove, the supper keeping warm, the herbs on the windowsill, the order that had been built here over months from something that had been chaos. And he had an expression she'd seen on his face perhaps twice before. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. The expression of a man who has been through a very long winter and has just, that day, felt the first real warmth. Emmett came in behind him and Gerald behind Emmett, and Eliza put supper on the table and called for Lydia, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, all of them sat down together without anything unspoken between them. It was not a perfect supper. Thomas spilled his water. Emmett and Nathaniel disagreed with some heat about the management of the North Pasture cattle that had been delivered the previous week. Lydia ate her biscuits, star-shaped, as always on good days now, and watched the argument between her father and grandfather with the expression of someone filing information away for later use. Gerald said almost nothing, which was his way of saying everything was as it should be. Eliza sat at the corner of the table she'd claimed as her working end and ate and listened and thought that this was what a household sounded like when it was functioning. Not quiet, not smooth, just real. People at a table, disagreeing, eating, taking up space without apologizing for it. After supper, after the hands had gone and Lydia had gone up to bed, Nathaniel came back to the kitchen while she was washing up. He stood at the counter and didn't say anything for a while, in the way he sometimes stood in the kitchen when he had something to say and was finding the right approach to it. She waited. I want to talk to you about your position here, he said. She kept washing. All right? You've been paid as a cook, he said. That's not accurate anymore. It probably stopped being accurate 2 months after you arrived. He paused. What you've done for this ranch goes well past cooking. The supply management, the investigation, the work with the prosecutor's documentation. The other ranchers have asked about you. 2 of them want to correspond with you about their own supply records. She set the last dish in the drying rack and turned around. What are you proposing? A new arrangement, he said. Better wage. Formal responsibility for supply management across the whole operation. And he stopped. Something in his expression shifted into the territory of careful. I want you to stay. Not just through the season. I want you to stay as long as you want to be here. She looked at him. This is your home, he said, if you want it to be. She was quiet for a long time. Not because she was uncertain. She'd known, somewhere below consciousness, that this was coming, had felt the shape of it for weeks the way you feel weather before it arrives. She was quiet because the sentence itself required a moment, because she was 38 years old and had spent the better part of 20 years moving between places that needed her but had never quite been hers, and someone saying the words, your home, with the specific weight Nathaniel put on them, was not something she'd been prepared for, even now. I'm not easy to work with, she said. I keep my own records.
I have opinions about how things should be run, and I say them.
I've noticed, he said, and I'm not going to stop. I know. She turned back to the counter and wiped it down because her hands needed something to do. Then yes, she said, I'll stay. He didn't make a production of it. He simply nodded, the way he nodded when something important had been settled, and he said goodnight and went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a while after he left, in the quiet that had its own texture now. The quiet of a house that was full, that had people in it living their lives, even when those people were asleep. She thought about the morning she'd arrived in Clearwater, the employment office and Aldous Finch and his pressed mouth, the way Silas Crow had walked through the door and waved his hand at a room full of women as if they were inconveniences, the wagon ride out to Ravenwood with a man who hadn't slept reliably in months, and the kitchen she'd walked into that first afternoon, and the notebook she'd opened at the kitchen table that first night with the lamp burning low. She thought about all the rooms she'd left in 20 years, all the kitchens that had been temporary by nature, by contract, by the simple fact that nobody had thought to ask if she wanted to stay. She thought, the world will tell you, if you let it, that you need its permission to take up space. It will tell you this in small ways and large ways, and through the mouths of people who don't even know they're saying it. It told her in employment offices, and in the faces of men who looked past her, and in the kitchens where she was useful but not valued, necessary but not known. And the thing she had learned, the thing that had taken her the better part of 38 years to understand fully, was that the world's permission was not the thing you actually needed. What you needed was stubbornness. The specific, quiet stubbornness of showing up and doing the work and keeping your notebook and not going away just because someone had decided in 10 seconds that you weren't worth their time. That was the whole of it. There was no secret beyond that. Spring moved into summer, and the ranch moved with it. The North Pasture cattle settled in. The garden expanded. Lydia had appointed herself something between an assistant and a supervisor of the East Plot, which Eliza accepted on the grounds that she was more useful there than she was an obstacle. The hands rotated through the season's work. Gerald managed the pasture and reported to Nathaniel and occasionally stopped in the kitchen to say something brief and useful and then left without ceremony. The correspondence with the other ranchers became a regular thing. Two of them wrote to Eliza directly about their supply systems, formal letters that she answered with practical advice, and in one case, a template for a daily delivery log that she'd refined over months. She did not think of this as anything particular. It was just solving a problem that needed solving. Emmett spent his mornings outdoors now, moving around the ranch with the purposeful authority of a man who had remembered what he was for. He still had his opinions about the cattle. He still had his opinions about everything. The difference was that he voiced them at the table rather than from the distance of the upstairs hallway, and the opinions, when they came from the table, could be argued with. Nathaniel argued with them regularly. This, Eliza understood, was its own kind of healing. Lydia turned 10 in June. She had asked, months ago and very specifically, for a birthday pie rather than a cake. Apple, with the star cutter used on the pastry top as well as the biscuits. Eliza made it on a Saturday morning with Lydia standing at the counter beside her working her section of the pastry dough, with the concentration she brought to everything now. Focused, a little serious, occasionally asking a question that was more perceptive than you'd expect from a 10-year-old. "Did you know," Lydia said, pressing the star cutter into the dough, "that you're different from how you were when you came?" Eliza looked at her. "How so?" Lydia considered. "When you came, you watched everything, like you were deciding whether to stay." She looked up. "You don't do that anymore." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that." "I notice things," Lydia said, plainly, stating a fact about herself. "You do," Eliza agreed. "You get it from your grandfather." Lydia seemed to consider whether this was a compliment. "I think I also get it from you," she said, "from watching you." Eliza didn't say anything. She pressed the dough into the pan and trimmed the edges and didn't say anything because some things deserved a moment before you responded to them. "That might be true," she said finally. Lydia placed the last pastry star on top of the pie with the careful exactness of someone who understood that position mattered. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "So am I," Eliza said. She meant it in all the ways it could be meant. The wages and the work and the supply records and the notebook that was now on its 4th volume. She meant the kitchen and the table and the people who came back to it. She meant the quiet mornings before the house woke up, which were still hers, still the best hour of every day. She meant Lydia standing at the counter with flour on her hands, and that 10-year-old serious face, and the star cutter that had come up from the cellar and was now used so regularly it lived on the shelf with everything else. She meant all of it. Silas Crowe was sentenced in May. 7 years. His assets were liquidated to cover the restitution amounts, which were distributed across the 5 ranches according to the documented losses. The Clearwater Merchant Association reorganized under new leadership. 2 of Crowe's business associates were charged separately and pled to reduced counts. Eliza read the letter from the county prosecutor's office sitting at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. It was 2 pages, thorough, written in the careful prose of a man who took his work seriously. She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it with the other documents she kept in the back of the current notebook, and finished her coffee. She did not feel triumphant. She wasn't sure what she felt exactly. Something more complicated than triumph, which always seemed too clean an emotion for the mess of actual events. What she felt was something closer to settled. The way you feel when a long, difficult piece of work reaches its conclusion, not with a flourish, but with the simple fact of being done. She'd gotten up earlier than usual that morning, and she'd stood at the kitchen window in the gray light before sunrise and looked at the ranch, the outbuildings, the fence lines, the garden with its summer growth, the north pasture just visible from the side angle of the window. She'd stood there for a while, not thinking anything particular, just looking. This was a thing she never used to do. Stand still and look at a place without calculating what it needed or what was wrong with it or what she'd have to do next. She'd always been too busy moving to the next problem to simply look at what was in front of her. She was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to do otherwise. She was not a woman who would ever stop keeping notebooks or counting things or arriving before the house was awake. That was not the lesson. The lesson, if you wanted to call it that, was something less dramatic than transformation. It was just the gradual, hard-won understanding that a place could be yours without you having to earn it every single day. That the work you did could be done from a position of belonging rather than from a position of trying to prove you deserved to belong. The difference was small in everything. She'd thought once that what she needed from the world was acceptance, a room where her abilities would finally speak louder than the first glance. She'd spent years looking for that room. What she'd found at Ravenwood was something less tidy than acceptance and more durable. She'd found a place where her abilities were simply used, where the work was the work, and she did it, and it mattered, and nobody was keeping score of whether she deserved to be there, because the question had become irrelevant. She was there. She did the work. The work was good. That was the whole of it, simple and not simple at all. One evening in late summer, Nathaniel found her in the garden after supper. She was checking the tomatoes. They'd come in thick this year, thicker than she'd expected, and she was making notes about the yield versus the seed quantity planted, because that was the kind of information you'd want next year. He came and stood at the edge of the garden and watched her for a moment. "Emmett wants me to tell you," he said, "that the supper tonight was the best he's had since before Helen died. He asked me to pass that along because he said telling you himself would be embarrassing." She kept making notes. "Tell him I'll take that under advisement. He also said you're stubborn." "He's right about that." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He did that. Came to find her in the evening sometimes. Not with anything specific to say, just to stand in the same place for a while. She'd come to understand this as one of his ways of being present with people. He didn't require conversation to need company. "The prosecutor wrote," she said. "I saw the letter." 7 years. "Yes." He paused. "It's enough. I think it's enough." She thought about the 5 families in the valley, about the 2 who'd almost sold, about the foreman who'd noticed the supply shortfalls 8 months before anyone thought to question them, about all the things that had almost gone wrong, that had been so carefully arranged to go wrong, and the narrow margin by which they hadn't. "It'll have to be," she said. He looked out at the ranch, the evening light long and amber over the pastures, the mountains in the distance holding the sky up the way they always did, indifferent and enormous and beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they've been there long enough to stop asking to be noticed. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked up. "When you came," he said, "I almost didn't hire you." He said it simply, without flinching from it. Not because of your record, which was better than anyone else's, because of how you looked. I made the same calculation every other person made in less than a minute before I knew anything about you. He paused. I've been thinking about that for a long time. She looked at him for a moment, then she went back to her notes. You hired me anyway, she said, because Elias Brennan told me I'd be a fool not to. Then I owe Elias Brennan an apple cake. She wrote another number in the margin. You made the right decision, Nathaniel, however you got to it. I want to be the kind of man who would have gotten there himself, he said, without needing someone else to tell him. She put her notebook down and looked at him directly. This was one of the things she'd come to respect about him, that he held himself accountable, not just for what he'd done, but for what he'd been, even when the being wasn't the kind that had done real damage. It was harder to reckon with that kind than the kind that left visible marks. Most people never get there at all, she said. They make the bad calculation and they don't think about it again because the person they dismissed walked away and never came back. You didn't walk away. No, she said. I didn't. She picked up her notebook and finished the last entry. The tomatoes were going to require 3 more days before the next harvest was ready. She'd need to get more canning jars from the cellar. She closed the notebook. I've been thinking, she said, that we should expand the herb section along the east wall next year. The current yield is good, but we're still buying dried herbs in winter that we could grow and dry ourselves. He looked at her. You're already planning next year. I'm always planning next year, she said. That's how kitchens work. He almost smiled. The full one, this time. Not the ghost of it, but the real thing, appearing on his face the way something appears when it's finally stopped being withheld. All right, he said. Expand the herbs. She nodded and walked back toward the house, and the Montana evening closed in behind her, golden and enormous, and completely indifferent to how much had changed in the small human world below it. Inside, Lydia was at the kitchen table with her book, and Emmett was in the sitting room doing whatever Emmett did in the evenings with the newspaper and his opinions, and somewhere upstairs something needed fixing. There was always something that needed fixing. And the stove was warm and the kitchen smelled like supper, and the good bread she'd put up to rise before she went to the garden. She hung up her coat on the hook by the back door, put her notebook on the counter, put water on for the morning because the morning would come early and she'd want it ready. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked around at it, not calculating, not surveying for problems, just looking. This was where she had arrived. Not because the world had finally decided she was worth something, but because she had never stopped acting as though she was, even when everything around her was arranged to suggest otherwise. She had counted the flour sacks and kept the notebook and fixed the window screen and made the pie, and sat with the grieving child, and walked into the barn office at 3 a.m. with a piece of wire and no particular fear, and all of it, every small and unremarkable piece of it, had added up to this kitchen, this ranch, this life that was hers in all the ways that mattered. The world does not give you your place. You find it. You build it. From the ordinary materials of showing up and doing the work, and refusing, with the specific stubbornness of someone who has no other option, to accept that the first judgment is the final one. She had never been the person anyone expected. She understood now that this was not a problem to be solved. It was simply the truth of who she was, and who she was had turned out to be enough. More than enough. She turned off the lamp and went upstairs, and Ravenwood Ranch settled into the deep summer quiet. The animals in the barn, the hands in their quarters, the family in its rooms, and the Montana night came down over all of it, vast and dark and full of stars, covering everything without distinction, the way the night always does.